Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains mature language, content, and spoilers. You have been warned.
And welcome back again to Syntax Error. I remain, as ever, Scott Thurlow, joined tonight by Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Good evening.
And Stephen Amosi.
Hello.
And tonight we're going to be talking about sort of something, a bit of nostalgia, but a legitimate thing that started when we were children, growing up gaming, and exists to this day. That is to say, the console wars. Which ones are the best and why? Or is this question even valid at all?
Dun, dun, dun.
Yes.
And who had the bloodiest battles?
Yes. So, as a bit of a background, we did a bit of research. We are now in the 8th generation of consoles. However, the thing is, because of our age, we started in the 3rd generation.
Right.
So there were 2 generations essentially that existed beforehand that we weren't part of at all. So it had no bearing on us.
Mostly
Nevertheless,
forgettable, yeah.
If I may, there are a number of names that stuck throughout time.
Sure.
You have the Ataris, the ColecoVisions, things like that.
right?
And
There's
television.
yeah,
And like in the legacies of like the ET landfills and things like
Right.
that. So
there's still landmarks and recognizable things, but we weren't quite there around when they were happening. So I think, do you want to do a little history, or how do you want to do?
I'll. You know what? Should we just go through all the?
Yeah, why don't you
the eras?
why don't you say out the eras and give us the big time hits from them?
I'm just gonna start off in '83 with the 3rd generation.
With the birth of us and the birth of our console
Right.
generation.
before you, may I claim that it's the actual first generation and everything else is like pre-civilization?
Yeah,
No,
I completely.
It's really
agree
funny,
with that.
like you said that to us precast, and I think that's a really good description. I, of course, subjectively, I agree to it because that's the way it was to us, but I think it's still valid to an extent because the first 2 generations were essentially those companies.
Early adopters
Yeah,
basically were the only ones that had those.
Exactly. They were the ones figuring out how to make it, how to do it, and then 3rd generation really was when they knew they could do it, and
Yeah.
it took off. So
The first one that really proliferated the consciousness of America was probably the NES in 1983. That generation,
my birth year.
yeah, exactly, yours and mine.
Yes.
That generation saw the NES, the Atari 7800,
Which is the best Atari, as I recall, as well.
yeah, and the last one worth buying.
Best and last. Sure.
The original Sega, which is not the Genesis, which is the one that
That's
everyone's
what
going to
remembers,
remember.
too. We'll get to that, but yes, that's true. Technically, it came out then. Mhm.
And that's pretty much it from that generation. A little bit later, which I didn't even realize, the Commodore 64 came out after that.
But I think if you really want to discuss like the historical implications of this is really the death of Atari
Yeah.
and the old guard.
The Gold Guard, exactly, yep.
And the rise of Nintendo, because the NES is really, I feel, the only important. Not to like, say, yeah, you lay the foundations for Sega, but the Genesis is what people remember.
Right.
The NES dominated this field. If you're doing like the dinosaurs, like
Sure,
you have the
yeah,
T-Rex
I mean,
dominating
yeah.
this.
No, you're right.
Consciousness of
It was the Cretaceous era of video games.
You had, you had
It was a
the
top predator.
NES. You had Super Mario Brothers came out of that era,
course,
and
yeah.
that might be the most influential video game that's ever existed.
No, I mean,
you could definitely make that case.
I definitely, actually, heavily agree with that point.
Yeah.
sure, it was a defining moment, and we happened to be, as we just mentioned, born in or around that time. Therefore, we're there to experience it and, in fact, grow up with it, which is, in fact, a large part of our histories. So I agree with you to the extent that that one matters the most, or
Right.
is the most pertinent to this.
So then you had the 4th generation, which was our 2nd generation, which the first console that came out in that generation was the Genesis
Right.
in 1988. And then the SNES came out in 1990. You also had in that era the Sega CD, Sega 32X, and the Neo Geo.
Real quick, I think right there, that moment when that was happening, that was, I'm going to argue for, the height of perhaps the console wars for us.
Well, Sega was really, really trying
Yeah.
at that
Yes,
point.
we'll get to that.
Like,
but
they were
only-
trying super
exactly.
hard. And I think that the problem was that they didn't ride the Genesis as long as they could have, because the Genesis was actually really,
a really
great.
solid machine, sure.
It was really great. It had a lot of really great games.
Definitely.
And then they went to CD and 32X, and nobody bought those damn things.
Well, some people did, just not as many.
It's also, Sega was attempting to challenge Nintendo's dominance at this point.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And yes, perhaps if the SNES wasn't the perfect machine, it could have dethroned. But Nintendo followed up with the NES with the SNES, which was a very strong showing. And so Sega kind of was playing at a disadvantage.
Yes,
here.
you're right. That's absolutely true. I agree with that. I also want to say, you're saying the SNES wasn't a perfect machine? I think it was. It definitely was, yeah. Because
if
of
it
that,
wasn't the perfect machine, then Sega would have had better claim at the throne.
You're right. Okay.
But
just to be clear.
SNES
the heir to the throne of the
Nintendo
video
made the
games.
perfect follow-up to the NES.
All right. Yep. I just certainly agree with that. So hit us with the next
So
one.
then we have the next era, which is between 93 and 98. PlayStation came out.
Which is a big one as well. Big landmark. I
And
think.
the Sega Saturn came out the same year, which was probably the last Sega game worth buying. And actually, to start this era out, I should have probably mentioned this first, although it was already a dying console and company at the time. Atari released the Jaguar in 93.
Yeah, well, they sticking with the metaphor or the analogy of the dinosaurs, they were no longer top predator. In fact, they were being eaten by the other ones who were evolving that were better than them.
And perhaps Nintendo's first mistake, although I don't think anyone realized it at the time, the 64 came out in 96.
Yeah.
And
True, okay.
I think the change of controller really hurt them in the long run.
That's an interesting point. We'll talk about that in a bit, but
because
I
as
like
much
it.
as I enjoyed the controller when I was playing N64, the next generation really made me realize how bad the controller for that was.
I'm going to preempt this discussion for later, but I think the issue here is that the PlayStation came in at the right time, where Sega had failed to in the previous
I
generation.
definitely agree with that. That's a very good point.
Video games now were starting to move from just kids really to having more of an adult audience, and PlayStation catered to that, where the Nintendo, and still today, Nintendo seems to fall back on trying to win the youth vote. And the PlayStation found the chink in the armor, and that's why it started to dominate over the N64.
I think that's a really good point. You're absolutely right about that. They either intentionally or not, or to some degree, they were at the right time and place for it, and were able to use that as leverage to catapult themselves.
I would also like to point out that the PlayStation, around the same time that the N64 came out, maybe a year afterwards.
It's pretty close, plus or minus, yeah.
The PlayStation came out in 94, N64 came out in 96, so there was a 2-year gap there. But around the time the N64 came out, the PlayStation developed something that nobody understood at the time would do this, but completely changed the face of video gaming, and they developed a DualShock controller.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting for you to say
that. 2 joysticks. And they kind of took what N64 did with their controller with the one joystick and made it better, for lack of a better term. Even though the DualShock on the original PlayStation was not great,
I will speak about that at length.
It led the way.
Nevertheless, it was
for what the Xbox controller became.
Exactly.
And that was one of the best controllers that's ever been
Again,
created.
it was an early precursor in a sense. It wasn't quite pre-Civilization, but it was the next iteration of evolution, and which everything built upon after that. Absolutely.
The Bronze Age.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Let's keep mirroring it, and when we get to the Renaissance, we'll speak about that too.
So the next generation was 98 to 2005, and that kicked off maybe insubstantially with the Dreamcast, which
lackluster.
There was so much promise there, and it just kind of didn't fulfill it. And Sega was kind of dying at that point, I think.
Actually, oddly enough, it's a lot like the Atari Jaguar.
Right.
Yep. Good point.
It's the last grasp of a dying breed.
So that was 98.
It was a swan song of
in
that.
In 2000, PlayStation beat everybody else again to this next generation with the PS2. And then in 2001, GameCube came out, and also in 2001 was the first Xbox.
Right. Yep.
Which, to be fair, PlayStation 2 is the best-selling console of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah. By hard numbers, it kills everything.
I think it's because the Dreamcast kind of failed, and the PS2 came in before Nintendo and Xbox and Microsoft got into the race.
Again, so it seems Sony was able to strike lightning twice in a sense and capitalize again in a time and a place.
Right.
Good.
Right, exactly. So then we move on to the next generation, which is 05 to 2012, which is not this generation that we're in right now, but the previous one to us.
Just before.
In 2005, Microsoft jumped in the race first.
It's a classical age.
With the with the Xbox 360. And then in 2006, both the Wii and the PS3 came out. And I think the 360 was the clear winner for hardcore gamers in this.
In the US,
in this race. However,
this is a really interesting case. This is what I want to get into. Go ahead.
The Wii sold so many more units than all
the Wii.
These other
obliterated sales numbers, but I think the gaming culture chose 360. Or at least, again, you're right. That the hardcore in quotes gamers preferred that one, but nevertheless.
All right. So here's some hard numbers on the sales of the Wii, the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360. So the Wii did dominate with 101.56 million units sold.
Yep.
Xbox was next with 84.4 million, and PlayStation 3 was right after with 80 million. What's interesting about this is the PlayStation 3 was a better seller in almost every market but America. It's the American market that carried the Xbox 360 to beat PlayStation 3 overall.
Right. That is a quite interesting stat. We stumbled upon that during our pre-research, and I mentioned that too. Like, again, sort of reversely, in this instance, Microsoft, at least in America, capitalized upon their time and place.
Yeah.
But still, it was crushed elsewhere.
I would say that I think the big reason that Microsoft won out there was the controller. Again, the controller has so much to do with how you play a game.
I agree with that, of course.
And the Xbox 360 controller, despite the fact that the PS3 had better graphics, the controller made it such a more enjoyable experience.
I'd like to discuss all of the pros and cons of the two
later.
Yeah.
Okay. I would also like to point out, as far as sales numbers go, that I think that the reason that the Wii won was because it was the first modern console that was really inclusive for everyone. You know, this was a game that had games for kids.
Well, yeah, like Ian said earlier,
had the Wii Fit. You know, you could go and work out in front of it. So it was kind of like they wanted to put something out for everybody. They wanted to get as broad a range of people as they possibly could, and they did a really good job of that.
Yeah, well, Nintendo, Ian pointed that out, or alluded to it earlier, that they knew what they were doing marketing-wise, sort of, and could capitalize on that aspect in order to win out in that sense.
Exactly. So then we have the present generation.
Postmodernism era.
Which is 2012 to the present. We had, in 2012, the Wii U came out, and then in 2013, the PS4 and the Xbox One dropped. So I think we discussed this earlier, and the clear winner in this console war has been the PS4.
There was no question about it based on the numbers.
And they really just streamlined all the problems that they had with their previous consoles.
Yeah, for sure.
So as far as the PlayStation goes, I think they've done a hell of a job. They really only had one
glaring issue,
one generation where they really lost out.
Oh, okay. Yeah. True. That's true. Go ahead.
These figures might not be 100% accurate when you're listening to this, but this is
the best we can research is as follows.
We're going to start with the best, which is the PS4, which has sold 35.9 million units
worldwide.
Yes,
okay.
But this is also an interesting stat that I noticed. It's not only how many were sold, but how many were produced. So they produced 37.7 million units and sold 35.9. That's a large majority.
It's pretty damn good in terms of ratio.
And it'll be more important when you see what happens later on.
There's a reason we're pointing this out, but for sure.
Now, the Wii U has sold 12.6 million, which has not been as near a success as the Wii was, but it also only produced 12.6 million. And this is, I'll get to this later, but Nintendo has a very smart trick up their sleeve.
They have a savvy business move of doing this.
They limit their releases, and I'll explain that a little bit later. This is the fall of the Xbox.
Yeah. Telling number right here.
Units sold 3 million.
For Xbox One. Units produced?
Produced 10 million.
Yeah. That's harsh, Murray.
That's not even 50% of what they sold.
Sure. I mean, and business-wise, that is
devastating.
Yeah, it's intense to think about that.
It's Dreamcast
numbers. That's a stat you read out to me when we were doing our, when you pointed out, and I didn't think that was such a huge disparity between those. And knowing that, it's now it seems obvious why they've lost.
But I mean, think about it.
Or are losing
think
right
of everybody
now.
You know that plays games. Like, if they have a PS4 or an Xbox One, they probably have a PS4 as opposed to an Xbox One. I know two people that have Xbox Ones.
Sure. So that's sort of the broad history. So I kind of want to get into what our personal experiences were, which I think go to the 83 to 88 generation, starting out with the original NES. So I'll give you a brief history of mine. I, of course, grew up with NES, solely. I was basically a Nintendo household. I was probably earlier than most people, kids were when getting games. I was 8. If I had to randomly guess, maybe kids were 10 or 11 when I got it. So I got it very early, and Nintendo only. My parents they had enough money, but they certainly were not rich. The reason I'm bringing all this up, I'll get into another example when it hits later on. But I just had NES. That was all I had. I played the shit out of course, and that's when I became enamored with games and where I am now. However, when the SNES, I think the height, as I mentioned, was SNES versus Sega Genesis or 32X, whatever one you want to call it. I still, my parents were basically stuck with Nintendo, so here's the next Nintendo system. But many friends that I had, grammar schoolish around that time, 5th, 6th grade, something like that, they had both. So I would go over their house and play Sega. Here's what I'm getting at. It's sort of a psychological thing. The one you had, this is a point that's been raised in other places, but I think it's true. The one you had, you're going to defend because that's the one you had.
Right.
But if you had both, there was really you weren't in the console wars.
Well, you had anybody who had Sega had a Genesis. I don't
Yes.
think I know anybody that had the original Sega.
I may or may
When
not
I
have,
was
but
a kid.
that certainly was the most.
The
That was,
Genesis
again,
came out in '88, so I would have
Right.
only been 5 years old when that came out. Anyway,
but it was the height of it. Is
so
what
I
I'm
remember
saying. Sure.
getting. I remember getting the NES. Well, honestly, the SNES came out in 1990, so we were only 7 when that came out. So you must have been. You said 8. I probably got it when I was 8.
Maybe I'm doing the math wrong. All I can say to you is I definitely had the original NES first, and
Yeah,
when
me
the
too.
SNES came
Me
out,
too.
we also got that.
I think I actually got the NES. I think I remember this exactly because I think when I got the NES, I got this game with it. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game.
Yeah, which is a great
At the
game.
same and Super Mario Brothers obviously because that came with it. But I think that was 1989, right? So that was 6 years after the NES had come out.
Yeah.
But it was a good 6 years. I remember when I was a little kid, going to my babysitter's house who had a son who was my age, and he had a Nintendo and playing like
Sure.
Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers 2, Super Mario Brothers 3, Excite Bike, a whole bunch of different games.
All the
where they were
classics.
like, yeah.
For sure.
But I don't remember playing any Genesis until a little bit later. Maybe when I was like 10 or 12.
Well, I'm a little bit younger than you guys, but my dad
but
was
not much.
kind of a gamer. Well, gamer is, I guess, too strong a word, but I remember
He dabbled in games.
Yeah, I remember playing games with him, and he enjoyed, he would buy games for me and then play them and then beat them when I was asleep, which was very frustrating to me. But
Betrayed. But sure.
so I had an NES growing up. I remember Duck Hunt and
Oh yeah, Duck Hunt.
Mario and the Impossible Ninja Turtles game.
The first one?
But
oh yeah.
I really grew up on SNES. I also had a
Okay.
Genesis too. I was a big RPG.
So you're one of those rich motherfuckers that I did not like
Get every console.
in middle school. Go on, yeah, sure. I get yours. I'm just busting your balls. But go on.
Ian looks completely defeated right now.
I was alone
Hey,
as a
listen,
child.
you won because you had both consoles. So go
Yeah,
on.
but I was an RPGer,
Sure.
and that was what the SNES was all about.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way. Like that's what we liked as a kid and still do. So they offered more of those kind of games. So I think that's a completely valid.
To bring this ahead a little bit, there's an argument that the PS3 was a console that tried to be more than just a video game console.
It tried to be
a multimedia system.
You know what's really funny?
So did Xbox to an
Well,
extent.
Xbox was more focused on gaming. And I feel that
It was at first, but I just want to tie it all back together. If you guys might recall, when the NES was originally marketed, it was called a home entertainment system, not a video game system,
Right.
which is exactly what PS3 tried to do later on.
But in reality, not just like the NES could not actually do that.
Right, of course, but I mean, that's how they spun it.
But I felt the Sega was always kind of harkened to the arcade games.
Yeah, that's
of
definitely
being
true as well.
action-packed, short,
Mm-hmm.
higher quality graphics, but less substance to their work.
That is
When you think of
100%
Sega,
true.
You have Sonic the Hedgehog. I remember an Odyssey or something like that, which was there's one RPG on Genesis that I remember, and it wouldn't even qualify as one on the SNES.
Right.
Yeah.
But SNES had lesser graphics, but because of that, they focused more on storytelling. And I've always been more
Right,
interested.
and that's
in
sort of
that
that's what we
stuff.
were interested in as
here's the
kids,
thing.
and we gravitated towards that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
So I think they were both 16-bit consoles, right?
Yes.
The Genesis and the SNES.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily that it had worse graphics, but the Genesis had some kind of, I don't even know what it was. The Genesis had some kind of like more
Might have more
a
processing
more like
power, or
flowing
something.
nature to like its
Sure.
graphics. I remember playing Genesis games and being like, "Oh, this game is crazy in what you can show," as opposed to the SNES, which seemed more like the original NES in terms of its graphics.
Sure, I see
I
what
will
you mean.
give you the distinct example between the two.
Okay.
Aladdin, the game.
Oh yeah,
Because they came out for both SNES and
Mhm.
for
That's a really good point.
Genesis, and there was a distinct difference between the two, graphically, gameplay style, And you can really
You're absolutely right about that. So all I'm saying, everything I just said only to allude the fact. So, and by the way, just a quick caveat, get this out of the way. Yes, we're ignoring PC at all because
that doesn't factor into console.
Sure. Well,
wars,
the thing is, I wanted to bring in the sort of the joke thing, the PC versus the console thing, but this one specifically. So, like I said, it was sort of the thing, like when in the schoolyard playground. Oh, I've got Genesis, I've got NES or SNES. Mine's better because of X, but it doesn't actually matter.
It was all about what games you could play.
You didn't really notice that. We know that about Aladdin now. We could like realize that, but you might not have you probably didn't when you were a kid. So you just defended like voraciously whatever one you happened to have been bought by your parents, or maybe you asked for one and got the other. So I have no case of that happened.
I would say much more back in the day. There was a distinct difference in games that you could get.
Yeah.
Like now that is almost non-existent. I mean, you got Halo for Xbox and
sure, they have their
like Uncharted.
They've got their
like
franchise
Metal
exclusive,
Gear
but you're right. Like
for PlayStation, but
you're totally right about that.
Back in the day, there were a lot of games that you could only get for one system.
Yeah, that's true. They're much more specialized, if you will, for lack of a better term. But using that example that you just said, there's no way you could get, say, like a few of the classic games that we love from our childhood that happen to be Nintendo games. You can't play Chrono Trigger. You couldn't have played that on Sega. You couldn't have played Secret of Mana. You couldn't have played Final Fantasy 3 at least. So yeah, you're right. I think that was sort of a difference. Looking back on it, Sega sort of like they were like the Mortal Kombat style games, whereas Legend of Zelda would be
actually that's another good. There's Mortal Kombat and SNES and Mortal Kombat,
and it was edited and all that shit. Yeah.
And there were real distinctions.
Sure, you're right. Therein lies a difference, but broadly, and again, then of course, my best friend when I was in middle school had both. He was more affluent than I was. So I'd go over to his house, and there was no distinction in his mind and anyone else who was in a similar situation. There wasn't a console war. You didn't have to defend anything because you had both. But
see, I didn't have any friends to debate this with, so all I had to do was compare inanimate objects in my room.
Well, that sounds like a game unto itself, but
I would say going into the next generation, something that you actually kind of reminded me of by bringing up Final Fantasy was I wonder if PlayStation would have even really gotten off the ground
without
if N64 wasn't 2 years behind it, because
that's a good point.
Final Fantasy VII came out for PlayStation fairly early. I don't remember if it was before 96 when the N64
it was
came out. It probably wasn't.
Yeah.
But
I know what you mean, yes. And that's true.
But PlayStation, I think probably partially because they came out earlier, got the rights to Final Fantasy, which N64 did not. Like, and that's another crazy thing. Like the fact that N64 came out 2 years later, and imagining playing Final Fantasy VII on N64 is disgusting to me. Like the PlayStation
something about
had
it feels
so
wrong.
much better graphics.
Sure.
Like
97.
Okay, so it was a year after N64, and like probably right after GoldenEye, which was a great game that came out for 64. But
wait, that was a console-defining game, as was both of those were console-defining games for each respective console.
Final Fantasy turned into this big story, like cinematic almost storytelling
mess of mashups and mediums. Sure, but I know what you mean.
Platform.
Well, to that point, and to your point too, Scott, I had the N64 first. And I remember Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is the defining one, or Mario Kart.
Mm-hmm.
No,
all those were great 64 games, but PlayStation came out, and it took up the mantle of RPGs. Because Zelda is fine as an RPG, but it's more
it's
of an
not quite an RPG. Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah. That's true. That's a good point.
And then things like Resident Evil and Silent Hill came out, and I ended up getting a PlayStation because I couldn't play the games I wanted to. It's a reversal. I was sticking. I'm a very brand loyal person at times.
Yeah.
And so I had NES. I had SNES.
Especially when you're like 9 years old when N64 came out.
Sure. And I was let down by the N64.
The N64 was trying to play off nostalgia. Right?
Kind of. I'm not sure about that.
Nintendo's still doing that.
Yeah. I mean, that's Nintendo's always stick, of course.
Indeed. Exactly. But like, think about the N64. They came out 2 years after that console came out 2 years after the PlayStation, and they were like, we're gonna bring Mario into 3D or whatever, but it was still Mario, and it was playing off of that like pixelated type of graphics, whereas the PlayStation wasn't there yet. It still looked pixelated a lot of times, but it was trying to make it more make a smoother experience.
I see what you
whereas
mean.
N64, when you play Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask on the N64. There's no illusion that like this is a cinematic in any way.
I mean, you're right. Like again,
Whereas
I see your point completely.
In the PlayStation,
That's
they had those cutscenes. They could do cutscenes that were like much better than the N64, and it's kind of weird to me that, despite the fact that it came out 2 years earlier, that it had so much more processing power than the N64 did.
The thing is, Nintendo played it safe. I can't think of any N64 games, very much like Wii games, that really pushed the envelope.
I don't know. I would say that GoldenEye did.
Yeah, but it's still
GoldenEye
arcade.
changed the face of gaming.
I don't know if it pushed the envelope, but it was a landmark game in a broad sense.
It changed what a first-person shooter was.
I agree with that, but let me finish.
You had PlayStation that was taking more risks, creating games that you might have seen come out on SNES, or you might have seen come out on NES back in the day, but they were really attempting to court a different type of gamer.
I agree with that.
And a wider range. 64 was attempting to keep in the child market. Almost.
Kind of, yes, no. I want to cut out the difference between both of things you just said, because I think there's a large degree of legitimacy to both, but I'm not sure if I fully buy into both your points 100%. But certainly, it's something like, I'll reverse engineer it. They almost switched roles, if you will, like you said, right? Like, so now PSs are focusing on that kind of thing, as they either couldn't or wouldn't.
Right. Since
before.
Then, they have switched roles, yeah.
So, but N64, still enjoy Ocarina of Time. It's still one of my favorite games ever. I think they were pushing the envelope a bit more than you think they were, but they were still capitalizing on your love for the series and characters, of course.
Well, that's what I would say. Other than GoldenEye, think of every N64 game that you love. It's a continuing series that has been continued from before.
Of course.
Like Donkey Kong,
obviously,
or Donkey Kong Country, Zelda, Mario Brothers,
Mario Kart, even.
The Mario Kart games.
No, they had a wide variety of games on the 64.
Which ones do you remember?
They
Turok,
did,
maybe.
Yeah, Turok, I would say.
But that game was terrible. I remember playing that game and be like, this is a much worse.
Check it out our
GoldenEye
Turok episode.
Yeah.
But I see what you mean.
The thing is, I don't like GoldenEye either.
Now I did, of course, but here's a little consideration.
But you had friends to play it with.
Well,
I didn't. Not
that's
really.
The big thing,
kind of yes and no. But regardless of our friendships back in childhood, how many friends we did or not have, here it's something like this. Let me propose this and see if you guys agree. GoldenEye. First of all, there were less games in general being made back then. Overall, for sure. So that was one that everyone that I knew around that time loved the movie. So they capitalized on it, of course, making a game. As we know now, that often doesn't work out. In this case, it did. But also, it was one of the few games you could even get at the time, right? So almost everyone had it because of the tie-in to it. On top of that, it happened to be, being a quite good game,
right? That
introduced probably more people general to shooters,
and probably one of 4 games made based off a movie that was actually good.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying, right? So almost everyone had that, and it's sort of like
SNES Wayne's World wasn't great.
No, it was not that great, but it's sort of almost like an early viral thing. Where like, yeah, have you played GoldenEye? No, you should because it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
and then people started. It was.
I would agree with GoldenEye.
We're having LAN party. Yes, if you had enough friends who played it, and you could go over their house, you would have 4 people could play it at a time, and multiplayer was. That was earlier in the evolution. I
would completely agree with GoldenEye, but think of it this way: how many N64 games can you say that were original?
Do I remember?
That were original.
No, I know what you're saying, and you're right.
And think of how
not
many,
as many as you think.
First of all, every single PlayStation game that you played was basically original, other than maybe Metal Gear Solid, which was based off the Metal Gear franchise. But you had games like Banjo-Kazooie.
Sure, that's a good point.
Spyro,
Ratchet and Clank, was 2 maybe, but still, yeah.
Ape Escape, which was the first game that used joysticks to any strange degree, which kind of gets forgotten, but that was a really great game. You had Twisted Metal.
I remember, yeah, Twisted Metal's a good one. Yep, sure.
That was the start of the Gran Turismo franchise, and dozens of other ones. I mean, you could go and listen because it was a new console and they didn't have any franchise rights. Every game that they made was new, and they did it really well. They made a lot of original games.
You're right. You're right about a lot about that, and so he's got another one.
Did you know they had 3 South Park games on the N64?
I knew about one of them.
Yeah, exactly.
South Park Rally, and South Park Chef's Love Shack.
I did not know that 3 separate
Chef's Love Shack.
They had.
I kind of want to play Chef's
Love
Shack
64 though, which was
right.
Star Fox was that was original and that was very good.
Was really good on that.
Bomberman. Wasn't there an SNES Bomberman game? I think there was.
And They, of
There
course,
was
to your point, they did the N64 one, of course, to...
Oh, yeah, that's right. There was an SNES Star Fox game as well. That's right.
Yeah.
So, not that these games weren't good. They were fun, and they were enjoyable, and they continued the Nintendo legacy, whereas Sega died with the Saturn, and Jaguar absolutely died with the... or Atari absolutely died with the Jaguar. Nintendo was able to continue the legacy because they kept putting out these good games, but a lot of them...
But only that. Sure, I get it.
Almost all of them were based on older games, whereas PlayStation was putting out new content, and I would say that PlayStation won that generation.
Because of that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, of course. And everything you said is completely valid. And in fact, it's funny because Nintendo continues to do that to this day.
Right.
For sure. It's just that, subjectively, again, where we were in the time, now I sort of resent Nintendo for doing that. But if I were a different age, it
was a lot of fun to play, for sure, when you were a kid.
If we were falling to different generations, of course, then we would think differently about it. It just, we happened to fall into this one. Mm-hmm. So our subjective experiences are based on that.
I mean, honestly,
sure.
Some of the best games that have ever been made came out of that. Like, Ocarina of Time is, by many, professed to be the best game, that's ever been created.
No, it's the best N64 game. But again, we can fall into a rabbit hole.
Well, no, a lot of people say that it's like up there as one of the best games ever, and I can see that. It was a great game, but I prefer like Metal Gear Solid, the original Metal Gear Solid, or like Final Fantasy VII.
Let me just be clear: BioShock is the best game ever. I'm always gonna have to say that, but
BioShock's up there.
Again, let's not fall into a rabbit hole. But let me address like some of the broader points that you had said. Like, it seems obvious that was the case. That's what Nintendo was doing, and then so they were afforded the opportunity, or at least were fortuitously found themselves in the position to do all that, which elevated them, catapulted them again ahead in the lead because they weren't retreading it. But I also want to touch on a little something else you just said, which is going to tie into when we get to the just generation and one just before it. The controller for N64, it was awesome for GoldenEye and maybe two other games. There were definitely a few instances at that time where they had cross-platform games, so you could get one or get one for the other. Playing it, any other game other than that on that controller was a fucking bitch.
Yeah.
And it was horrible.
I recently tried to use that controller again. It's like the worst damn thing ever.
Yeah, but so again, like, you got used to it if you only had that.
Yeah.
But if you had other options, you'd realize this is not the best one. Why did they do this? But it's the one we have. So that ties into, give us the facts or a little rundown of the next generation. After that, it's coming into the PS2 or 3, right?
The 2, yeah. So like directly after, well, I guess it was a few years. Even the N64 was the last one to come out in that generation. And then it was not until, I guess, the Dreamcast in 98.
Which flopped pretty much.
Which did just as bad as the Saturn. And then PS2 in 2000 was the first real contender in there. Then you had the GameCube in 01 and the Xbox in 01. And the GameCube was a weird system.
I agree with that. It
had a lot of good games. It tried to be what the N64 was not.
Yes.
In terms of like trying to have original content, trying to do new things, and it failed horribly.
They basically
this
is what we wanted the N64 to be, but it was somehow worse.
They had little tiny CDs that you had to put into the fucking thing.
I had one in college.
Many people did.
I never bought one, but it somehow ended up in my room.
Yeah, my floor mate had
acquired one in college. Yes.
Monkey Ball was the only game that anybody played on that, I'm pretty sure.
Super Monkey Ball and Daft Punk was the greatest thing to enjoy my leisure activities too.
At that time, of course. Sure.
And I remember like 3 games from that because I
think they only made fucking 3 games of it. But
Super Monkey Ball was terrific, by the way.
Yeah, no,
but it was the only good game for that
that's what I'm saying. They might have.
No,
of course,
Windwalker.
Of course, they made more than 3 games.
Right.
But the 3 games everyone had was for that was Super Monkey Ball, Smash Brothers, or whatever it was. I think the first Smash Brothers came out for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And then whatever Smash Brothers came out, many people had it, and maybe like the original, like whatever Mario was bundled into it, and that was it. So yeah, you're right.
And Windwalker, as Ian just pointed out, which.
I didn't know anyone who had
I never played Windwalker.
Well, we're going to do a Zelda episode, but I mean, yes, it existed. All I'm saying is that, again, it existed in a weird place and time for it and was sort of short-lived. Yeah, I remember playing Monkey Ball for 1 year of college, like the entire year, and then sort of fell off the face of the earth.
I actually kind of want to go back and find that game and play it again because I did have a good time. But
as well, we'll do a Super Monkey Ball challenge, Syntax Error challenge later on the season. But moving on to...
Well, let's talk about PS2 and Xbox, because those are the big ones in there.
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
I had a PS2. I did not have an Xbox, but this was just about the time that I was getting into college.
Right.
And so everybody that went to college had a friend that had an Xbox.
You knew somebody who had one somewhere. And
You didn't always know somebody that had a PlayStation, but you definitely knew somebody that had an Xbox and played Halo on it.
Of course. Yep.
That was what I remember.
That was their killer app.
Yeah,
for sure.
Exactly. And I remember listening to the guys that designed Halo talk about like when it was coming out, how nervous they were. Like they didn't have a workable demo the first time they showed it, so they just like put up some video of
cutscenes
Halo and said that it was like in-game shit. Just BS their way through after that.
So they were lying in marketing, but it worked. Sure,
Yeah.
It's the American way.
But
it's Microsoft's way, at least.
But it worked out for them because Halo became the reason that
was
Xbox
iconic,
survived.
Yeah. I think, and right there, I think that ties in nicely that is a start of console exclusives, which are sort of like the bigger aspect of the newer gen console wars, if you will. Just real quickly, it wasn't about what console was better or not. It was about what games you can get on them, more so than ever.
Right.
Well, I remember someone had a hacked Xbox.
Yep.
Very nice. You got to play it.
That was enjoyable, sure.
I had the PS2, and I think I kind of fell off gaming for a while with the PS2. I don't remember much of that many great games that came out.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I feel like the PS2 was kind of like the PlayStation's N64, where it was like fine, they had good games, but they didn't really like push the envelope at all. They didn't really do anything. They just kind of
they fell prey to what they had
just kind of
before.
like continued on with what they had been doing before. They had good games. Don't get me wrong. I had a PS2.
Hill 2 is one of the ones that come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't really think
But
of
what else? Yeah, right?
Sure. I'm sure there are people, or if anyone watches this,
someone's screaming at their screen right now, like,
Maybe.
"Oh, what about?"
But no, I mean,
X?
like,
but
I sort of agree. It was somewhat forgettable. I can't name many aside from that I remember playing for it. And I didn't even have a PS2, but I did know, to your point, I knew people who did. And even amongst that, I can't think of anything.
Well, like with the N64, the only games that I can really that are really memorable from the PS2 are ones that continued a previous
franchise
series.
Yeah, sure.
I don't really remember like anything original that
any new
really
IP
grabbed
they
me
came
and
up
like
with,
like that I remember to
right.
this day. You know, granted, this is 16 years ago now that the PS2 came out, so it's a long time ago.
We remembered quite a bit about our youths, but you also said that we had picked up a number of different activities at this point in our life.
Exactly, yeah. Now at this point in my life, when I have a PS2, I am starting to drink and go out and try to meet girls and stuff. So there are a lot of other things on my mind. Also, try to pass college, whatever.
However priorities you assign to them, but sure.
Whichever one was that day.
Yes. But I mean, you're right. So yeah, again, this is going to be subjective, time and a place that maybe the reason we don't remember it as well is in part because of that. But also, I think does have a legitimate aspect to they probably were just retreading ground, at least that I can think of. So yeah,
I think a lot of it was that
there was no killer app in that sense as there was before and was later.
And the Xbox was the PS of the
yes,
of this
exactly.
generation.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I agree with that.
The Xbox had a lot of like new stuff that was coming out, and on top of that, they had
Dead Rising. I remember that.
I know we
game.
keep coming back to this, but they had a controller that was superior to any controller that ever. The Xbox controller was enormous and nowhere near as good as the 360 controller, but it was still better than every controller.
That became
had
a joke too.
That.
Like I can't remember who did it, but the joke was essentially you have to have fucking bare hands to play the Xbox because they just they fucked up the design on it.
I think the original Far Cry came out for Xbox.
I believe it did. I didn't play it on it, but
it might have come out for PS2 as well.
I played it later on, so I didn't have to use the Xbox controller. But.
Actually, I'll say this. This is kind of a weird gap, I think, for video games because previous generation to this with the N64 and the PlayStation had terrible graphics. But it was still transitioning from like the SNES and the Genesis.
You're right.
Oh, the graphics were amazing compared to like the SNES.
The PS2, but it still wasn't the quality that PC gaming had at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I had transitioned quite a bit over to PC gaming, and it required the next generation to really build up to that level where I could compete.
No, you're right. That's a very good point.
So you're saying that the PS2 and the Xbox competed, or not until the next generation?
The Xbox might have been the winner of the console battle, but the PC at this point was still overshadowing them.
Yep, I think that's accurate, and I probably would agree somewhat to it. Again, even though I still am not to this day a big PC gamer because I just never had one. Again, but I think that is valid. I think people at that time, those who could do it, were doing that, and therefore that's why it was sort of sort of a lag or a lull, if you will.
Well, yeah,
in the consoles.
This is the time frame where StarCraft came out.
Yeah, and all that.
And,
That's true. Yep,
like,
good point. You're right.
This was
Warcraft?
World of Warcraft came
World
out.
of
this time,
Warcraft.
like,
First of all, let's just
Warcraft 3.
let's-
Like there is a explosion of like
Yes.
computer games that people love in this era. So not that the computer is a quote unquote console, but perhaps the dearth of really memorable games in the console world is owed to the amount of memorable games that came out
To that,
in
sure.
PC world.
You guys are right, and let me take this moment to all my fallen friends and comrades who lost their college year to World of Warcraft when that came out.
Exactly.
But yeah, you're
You
right.
poor
I mean,
bastards.
it's legitimate because it came out for PC, so everyone was doing that, and
Right.
like consoles sort of like went by the wayside a bit for those who were really interested. Again, at least in our experience in time and place.
Yeah.
But I think that's all legit. So yeah, so now I'm getting to this. It's really funny that it seems like it should be a minor issue, but it's going to matter because it's a part of your hardware. The fucking controller issue.
Mm-hmm. You know what? As much as I've tried to like think my way around the controller issue, the controller is what connects you to the console.
Yeah, of course.
It is
It's how you drive your games.
It is probably the most important thing. As long as you have a good story, I can deal with any graphics.
Maybe
as
not,
long
but-
as I can control my character.
But I know
well.
what you mean. So here's the thing, right? So just to tie it on, at least for me, when I was a kid, I was a Nintendo cheerleader because that's what I had, and their controller was perfect. And maybe this, of course, again, like just in anything, when I went over to whoever's house, whatever friends I had that had Sega, I wasn't used to it. If you guys recall, they had an ABC button.
Yeah, they had
right?
3.
But of
buttons
course,
instead of
reversely, if I had gotten Sega first, I probably would have learned on that
Mhm.
and would have defended that.
Well, I had when I finally got a Genesis like years later, I had a crazy ass controller that had not only ABC but an XYZ
See, that's
section as well. That was like all turbo and shit. I don't even remember exactly why there were 6 buttons,
I
but
get
there were
it.
6. On
Yeah,
the
but
controller.
still, it's you learn on one. You learn on one sort of design, and you have
Yeah.
to be forced to play another. Of course, like you're gonna get your ass kicked if you're playing Mortal Kombat on one versus the other. Or anything
Absolutely.
Like
Alright, so while you guys were talking about controllers, I looked up PS2 games. Yeah, it's slim pickings actually,
that.
Yeah.
but we're very remiss for forgetting Grand Theft Auto 3.
All right, fair enough.
Yes, but
You're right.
still, like as I mentioned before, still a continuation of a
God of
previous
War.
PlayStation. God of War is a big one. You're right.
Yeah.
The original God of War came out for PS2.
That probably is the most significant one that came out.
Prince of
for it.
Persia: Sands of Time.
Okay.
Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4 came out for N64 though. I think they something like that. They reported it or something like that.
Shadow of Colossus and Ico.
Shadow of
three.
the Colossus was a groundbreaking game.
That's a good one.
So there
were a couple that we
of course,
we
and,
were
like,
remiss.
yeah, and not that I was trying to take anything away from that, but like really, I think what the PS2 was all about was keeping up the status quo for PlayStation.
No, I agree. So let me just go back to, or at least finish off what I was saying. So in the same sense that I was a Nintendo fanboy, I became an Xbox one solely because of the controller.
Mm-hmm.
It was the same situation. I was just older. Some people I knew had a PS3 and they were like, "Hey, play on it." I'd be like, "Okay," but I hate this fucking controller. It's unnatural. It doesn't conform to the
It
way
was
I,
the PS3's
the way I
biggest
think it should
problem
work.
was its controller.
Yeah.
You guys have weird hands.
What?
Maybe, but
Your giant hands should be like much more adaptable to the Xbox controller. I think you can just wrap your
I had
fucking
no
claws
problem
around
with
it.
however weird my hands are or not, it just felt unnatural. As you said, I wasn't as connected. I felt I couldn't control it as crisply as I could on PS versus Xbox. So I stuck with Xbox for the 360, that is, for the longest time. And finally, in this generation, our current one now, Sony, the meeting they had, guys, we got to fix our fucking controller. You got a dynamite
finally
system,
did, yeah.
but you got to fix the
Just
controller.
to move away from controllers for a second, which has been half the conversation, I wanted to talk
very
about
important.
the business aspect of how video games have transitioned from the early days. And now,
Okay,
because
sure.
Oftentimes, like Nintendo back in the Atari were solely video game producers.
Right.
So when something hit the fan, it could collapse a business.
Mhm.
One
That's true,
bad
yeah, that's a very good
console
point.
Could ruin. And I actually read a thing about how Nintendo still has that issue because they're really solely a video game company that they have to be very careful with the releases because they can't invest heavily in something that is,
That might
Two-
jeopardize
yeah,
that. Yeah, sure.
in a sense, they're afraid to innovate, so they stick with. And
Right.
actually, and I mentioned this earlier that I want to talk about it. Actually, they do very limited releases of their consoles
In order to
keep
keep
up
that, yeah.
demand. So they'll actually undersell and it's been very effective. As I said, they've sold 100% of their units they produce. Again,
because they keep a tight line on it.
Yeah, but they can't run the risk of what Microsoft can fail with the Xbox One and pawn off on other parts of the division.
Yeah,
and
Sony and Microsoft have much bigger companies.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's the thing is that dynamic changed the game so much.
You're right about that. That's true. That's a very good point.
You have these two mega corporations that now don't have to worry about.
Yeah, you're right. They can sink money.
Trade blows and still. You PlayStation, Sony, you won this round. I'm going to win the next one.
Yeah, they can sink money into it, like exactly what you said.
I'm actually kind of surprised that Apple hasn't jumped into the console game.
I don't give them
They
ideas.
probably will. Yeah, Christ.
Listen, I'm not giving them any ideas they haven't already.
They're already working on it, but
yeah,
sure.
the iConsole is coming out next generation.
Well, I can't wait for that, or I can, in fact.
Well, maybe it'll be great. Who knows? It could be the next.
You know what?
Original Xbox or PS.
As we were probably wrapping up here, I think it's going to live or die, and whether or not their controller is useful to me. So we'll see, Apple.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Where you were at the time and the place when whatever generation was happening, and what side of the fence you came down on, based on circumstances of what you were given, basically, or what you were able to afford, regardless of where you were.
I think we should briefly talk about the previous generation to now as well.
Okay.
Because we kind of glossed over it a little bit, and
right.
That is probably the generation that I was most involved in, quote unquote, hardcore gaming.
Sure.
So I had an Xbox 360 and a PS3, and the Xbox 360...
You fat cat bastard, as I said earlier.
Well, I finally was making a little bit of money. I was like, let me spend all of it on video games.
It's a good investment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it worked out really well for me. But the Xbox 360 was the console that I actually ended up using much more, despite the fact that not only for gaming, but also because it was easier to access any apps that they had or whatever.
Netflix,
I could get on a Netflix and things like that on there.
Yeah, that's a good point. They should seem tangential, but because, to Ian's point earlier, once they started trying to become, again, like, in quote, entertainment systems, not just video game systems,
right,
their presentation is going to affect what one you're going to use more.
Yeah, the Xbox definitely had like better access to stuff like that, and they also had a much better store for their games.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that, yeah. That's true.
The PlayStation 3 store was terrible, and PS4 has definitely made a marked improvement.
I don't love the
that.
PS4 one, but it certainly is an improvement.
It's definitely a lot better. PS Home thing that they did for PS3 was the worst. I thought it was an awesome idea at first, and I immediately was like, "This is terrible." I don't know why.
Is that the virtual?
Yeah, it's where you like go walk around with your avatar and hang out with other people.
I went into a theater and watched on my TV a projection of a theater and watched Afro Samurai on it, which was really strange to me. But
surreal experience.
I had both the Xbox 360 for a while, and then I got the Red Ring of Death, and I sent it in to get fixed, and it was never returned.
That's harsh.
You should complain.
I should have, but I was busy with other leisure activities.
You should complain 3 years ago or whenever that was. Yeah.
Go on.
But the PS3 I really didn't enjoy for a very long time. I know you guys have been very critical of it, but that was my console for a very, very long time.
See,
and it's interesting to me. The point is, I remember when it was really marketed for being able to do Blu-ray movies.
Yeah, well, that's true. Good point. Yep.
And that's an obsolete technology now, so which is all about streaming now.
It's true.
So
that's really funny.
It's not completely obsolete, but
I mean, no, that's a funny point. Again, the thing is that my experience was for the PS3 specifically that I was like, the graphics look amazing, but fuck the controller. Like, I don't know what to say. So
well, for a long time, so that's actually an interesting thing to briefly point out. The PS3 could play Blu-ray, and the Xbox 360 you could get a separate attachment that could play HD DVD.
Yeah.
Which I'm pretty sure the only reason that HD DVD lost that war,
that separate battle,
was because you needed a separate attachment on the Xbox 360.
Sure.
The PS3 for a long time was the cheapest Blu-ray player that you could get, and it also played games. It was like the most incredible thing ever.
Sure, I mean that's a good point.
But yeah, so that's just a little something
that might have affected it.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And then now we're up to the current day.
Which PS4 is dominating.
PS4 is killing it, and deservedly so.
I think so. Like, I switched, so again, like,
I've been a PS guy, PS, PS2, Xbox, PS4.
All right. My history is that we'll close off with that, right? Nintendo, and then Xbox, Microsoft, and then once this generation hit, I looked at the specs. I was able to pick which one I wanted, and the deciding factor, of course, they fixed the controller. Boom. Sony, you got me.
Nintendo, PlayStation.
All right.
Yeah,
You've been
so
very consistent. Well, there you go. So that's where our history of the trenches of the console wars and where we started out and where we came down and where we are now. But I think that'll do it for tonight. Anyone have any closing thoughts or funny little anecdotes?
No, I'm not a funny person. I'm not going to.
All right.
I have anecdotes, but none of them are funny.
Fair enough. Well, we'll see you next time.
All right. Have a good one.
This has been Syntax Error. Thank you as always for listening, and we will see you next time.
Music by Stephen Ormosi. Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.
Syntax Error is part of a Lost Signals Productions. All rights reserved.